They say grief makes you forget things, names, dates, where you put your keys, but no one tells you that grief also makes you notice the wrong things too late. Because if I had noticed earlier, if I had trusted that tight feeling in my chest instead of explaining it away, I wouldn't be telling this story now. It was 11:47 p.m. when my phone rang. Not vibrated, not buzzed, rang. That alone was strange. No one calls me that late anymore. I was already in bed, the lights off, the TV murmuring softly in the background, some rerun I wasn't really watching, the kind of noise you keep on just to remind yourself you're not alone. My phone lit up on the nightstand. Unknown number. I stared at it for a long second. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But grief does something else to you too. It makes you crave connection, even when it comes wrapped in discomfort. So I reached over, slid my finger across the screen, and said, "Hello?" There was a pause, long enough for me to pull the phone away from my ear and check the screen again. Then a man spoke. His voice was calm, too calm. "Before you turn on the light," he said, "check under your bed." I sat up so fast the sheets twisted around my legs. "What?" I whispered. "You forgot to lock your window last night," he continued, like he was reminding me about an overdue bill. "And you pushed the suitcase too far under the bed. It's sticking out on the left side." My heart slammed so hard I thought I might pass out. I hadn't told him where I was. I hadn't told him my name. And yet, every word landed like he was standing right there in the room with me. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my effort to control it. Another pause. Then he said something that made my blood turn ice cold. "I returned your phone today. You thanked me. Remember?" The call ended, just like that. No goodbye, no explanation, no sound but the quiet hum of the TV and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I sat there frozen, phone still pressed to my ear, staring at the darkness of my bedroom. My bedroom, the same bedroom he had just described. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at me not to, I leaned over and turned on the lamp. Warm yellow light filled the room. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I slid off the bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor, and crouched down. I looked under the bed. My suitcase was there, on the left side, sticking out, exactly like he said. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just sat there, staring into the shadow beneath my bed, trying to understand how a stranger could know something that specific, something that private. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text message from the same unknown number. "I told you not to turn on the light." That's when panic finally took over. I jumped up, locked my bedroom door, and backed into the corner like that thin piece of wood could protect me from someone who already knew too much. My thoughts raced. Was he outside? Was he watching through the window? I forced myself to breathe, in through my nose, out through my mouth. Slow. Think. The man said he returned my phone. That part was true. Earlier that day, I had lost it. I remembered the moment vividly because it had already been one of the worst days I'd had in months. Long shift, crowded commute, my mind elsewhere. I must have dropped my phone on the train platform. I hadn't noticed until I reached into my bag and felt nothing but fabric. I'd panicked immediately. My whole life was in that phone. Photos, messages, banking apps, notes I wrote when I couldn't sleep. Everything. I used a coworker's phone to call my number. It rang once, then stopped. I thought that was it. Gone. But an hour later, I got a call. A man said he'd found my phone. He sounded nice. Normal. He told my name, confirmed the lock screen photo, even joked about how cracked the case was. We met in public. A coffee shop. Bright lights, people everywhere. He handed me my phone with a smile and said, "You're lucky I picked it up before someone bad did." I'd laughed nervously and thanked him at least 3 times. I remember feeling relieved, grateful, safe. That memory twisted now, sour and wrong, because the voice on the phone tonight was the same. I was sure of it. I picked up my phone again, hands shaking, and dialed the number back, straight to voicemail. No name, no greeting, just silence. I checked my windows, locked. The front door, locked. I checked every room, every corner, every shadow. Nothing. No one. And yet, I didn't feel alone. I sat back on my bed and stared at my phone, trying to make sense of it. Had he followed me home earlier? Had he seen inside my apartment somehow? Or worse, had he accessed something on my phone while it was missing? The thought made my stomach turn. Another message appeared. You always pause the TV when you get scared. I looked up. The TV was paused. I don't remember touching the remote. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't imagination. This was someone who had been watching me closely enough to learn my habits. Someone who knew my space, my routine, my fear. I typed back with trembling fingers. Stop. Leave me alone. The reply came instantly. I just wanted you to know how easy it is. Then nothing. No more texts, no more calls, just silence. But silence, I learned that night, can be louder than any scream. I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed until dawn, lights on, phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline, replaying every moment of that day, every smile, every word, every second my phone had been out of my control. And the scariest part? He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't demanded anything. He hadn't even raised his voice, which meant, whatever this was, it wasn't finished. It was just beginning. By the time the sun came up, I still hadn't slept. The call, the messages, the way that man's voice slid into my bedroom like he belonged there. All of it circled back to one moment. The moment my phone left my hands. Because nothing like this starts at the moment you realize you're in danger. It always starts earlier, when everything still feels normal. That morning, the day I lost my phone, I remember thinking how tired I was. Not just physically, emotionally. The kind of tired that makes you move through the world without really seeing it. I'd just finished my shift downtown. Rush hour crowds, loud platforms, everyone pressed too close together. I stood near the train doors like I always did, scrolling mindlessly, barely paying attention to anything around me. I got off 2 stops later, walked up the stairs, reached into my bag, and felt nothing. No phone. My stomach dropped so fast it made me dizzy. I stopped walking immediately and dumped my bag onto the sidewalk. Wallet, keys, charger, receipts, everything spilling out in front of strangers who stared like I was losing my mind. But my phone wasn't there. I spun around looking back down at the platform, already knowing what I'd see. Nothing. The train was gone. And so was my phone. I felt exposed in a way I can't fully explain, like my entire life had suddenly been ripped open. That phone wasn't just a device. It was my messages, my photos, my notes, my calendar, my banking apps, my address, my routine, everything. I borrowed my coworker's phone and dialed my number. It rang once, then stopped, straight to voicemail. That sound, cut off mid-ring, felt like a door slamming shut. I told myself to stay calm, filed a lost item report with transit services, even though I knew the odds were slim. Then, trying to convince myself it was just a phone, that I could replace it, that nothing bad would come from this. I was wrong. About 2 hours later, my coworker's phone rang again. Same number. I answered it. A man's voice came to the line. Calm, polite. "Hi," he said. "I think I have your phone." Relief hit me so hard my knees almost buckled. He described the case, the lock screen photo, even the crack across the corner. There was no doubt. It was mine. He suggested we meet somewhere public to return it. A cafe near the station. Bright, busy, safe. I agreed immediately. When I got there, he was already seated near the window, my phone on the table in front of him like it was no big deal. He stood when he saw me, smiled. Normal smile, friendly, forgettable. Nothing about him triggered alarm bells. At least, not then. "Glad I caught you," he said, sliding the phone toward me. "You're lucky I picked it up before someone bad did." That sentence again. Before someone bad did. I laughed nervously and thanked him more times than necessary. My hands shook as I turned the phone on. Everything looked normal. Same wallpaper, same apps, same messages. I didn't notice anything wrong. Why would I? We talked for a minute, just small talk. He told me his name, Ethan. Said he worked in IT. Said he believed in returning things because karma matters. He didn't ask for money, didn't linger, didn't cross any obvious lines. Before leaving, he said something that stuck with me later. "You might want to change your passwords," he said casually. "Phones are easy to get into." I remember nodding, embarrassed, like I'd been careless. I thanked him again. Then he walked out of the cafe and disappeared into the crowd. And I never saw him again. Or at least, not in the way I expected. That night, I used my phone like nothing had happened. Texted friends, watched videos, scrolled until my eyes burned. I slept without fear. That's the part that scares me most now. Because danger didn't announce itself. It blended in. The next day, small things started happening. My phone battery drained faster than usual. Notifications disappeared before I could read them. Apps refreshed themselves. I blamed updates, glitches, normal tech issues. Then my calendar reminder shifted by an hour. Then a note I didn't remember writing appeared in my notes app. Just a single sentence. "Don't forget to lock the window." I deleted it and told myself I must have written it half asleep. I wanted to believe that, because the alternative was terrifying. Then came the call, the one where a stranger told me what was under my bed, the one that proved something was deeply, horribly wrong. Sitting there in the early morning light, replaying everything, I finally understood the truth. He didn't need to break into my home. He didn't need to follow me. He didn't need to hide outside my window. Because while my phone was missing, even briefly, it was enough. Enough to copy, enough to access, enough to learn me. And when he handed it back across that cafe table, smiling like a good man, he didn't give my phone back. He gave me something else. A silent passenger. Something that watched. Something that waited. And something that knew me better than I knew myself. And deep down, I knew one thing for sure. The calls weren't over. They were just getting more personal. By the third night, I understood something terrifying. Whatever he was doing, it wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate, personal, and escalating. After I powered my phone off completely, I thought the silence would calm me. It didn't, because silence gives your mind room to imagine everything that could still be happening without your knowledge. I sat on my couch with the phone face down on the table, like it might wake up on its own. Every few minutes, I caught myself staring at it, waiting for it to buzz. It didn't, which somehow felt worse. Around 9 a.m., I finally did what I should have done earlier. I called the police. I expected skepticism, confusion, maybe even dismissal, but when I explained everything, the lost phone, the cafe, the calls, the messages describing my bedroom, the officer on the line stopped interrupting me. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I need you to not turn that phone back on. Leave it exactly where it is. An officer will be there shortly." That was the first moment I felt something close to relief. 2 officers arrived about 40 minutes later. They were calm, professional, but I could tell this wasn't their first time hearing a story like this. I showed them the messages, played the voicemail, explained how the man had returned my phone at the cafe. One of them, Officer Ramirez, asked a question that made my stomach drop. "Did he have access to your phone while it was unlocked?" I thought back. The cafe. The moment I turned it on. The few seconds it sat on the table between us. "Yes," I said quietly. "For a minute, maybe 2. Officer Ramirez nodded slowly. "That's enough." They took the phone, placed it in a signal-blocking bag, and told me they were bringing in a digital forensics specialist. That word, forensics, made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. Dangerous, documented, traceable. An hour later, a woman named Claire arrived. Early 40s, sharp eyes, no nonsense. She introduced herself as a cybercrime analyst. She didn't dramatize anything. That scared me more than panic would have. She sat at my kitchen table and said, "I'm going to explain what likely happened. You can stop me if anything sounds familiar." I nodded. "When your phone went missing," she said, "it was most likely unlocked or unlocked easily. That gave him time." "Time to do what?" I asked. "To duplicate access," she replied. "Not steal the phone, not replace it, just copy it." She explained it carefully, step by step, how someone with basic technical knowledge, especially someone who worked in IT, could install a hidden monitoring profile, how that profile wouldn't show up like a normal app, how it could sync data quietly, location, usage patterns, notifications, camera access. Not constantly, just enough. "Think of it like a mirror," she said. "He wasn't watching you live every second. He was collecting pieces, patterns." My mouth went dry. "The bedroom?" I asked quietly. "The suitcase under the bed." Claire nodded. "Photos, accidental videos, reflections, background details. You'd be surprised how much of our private space ends up documented without us realizing it." I thought of every mirror selfie, every late-night video, every moment I assumed was private. "And the TV," I whispered. "He knew when I paused it." "Usage behavior," she said. "Fear responses are predictable, so are routines." I felt sick. "So he wasn't in my house," I said slowly. "No," she replied, "but he didn't need to be." Officer Ramirez leaned forward. "This kind of offender doesn't want speed," he said. "He wants control, familiarity, to know you before you ever know him." That explained the calls, the calm voice, the lack of threats. He wasn't trying to scare me away. He was testing how far he could go. Claire looked at me seriously. "There's one more thing," she said. I braced myself. "When he returned the phone," she continued, "that wasn't the end of access." "What do you mean?" I asked. She glanced at Officer Ramirez, then back at me. "He likely kept a cloned connection, even after you changed passwords, even after you turned the phone off." My chest tightened. "So he could still see me?" "Not now," she said quickly. "Not anymore. We isolated it. But before today, yes." That's when everything clicked. Why the messages felt delayed, why he referenced things from hours earlier, why he sounded confident but not urgent. He wasn't reacting, he was observing. Officer Ramirez stood up. "We're pulling CCTV from the cafe, we're tracking the number, and we're flagging similar reports." "Similar?" I asked. He hesitated just a second too long. "Yes," he said. "Similar." That word echoed in my head. Similar meant I wasn't the first, and I probably wouldn't have been the last. Before they left, Claire said something that still chills me. "The most dangerous part of this," she said, "is that you did nothing wrong. You trusted a normal interaction. That's how these cases start." That night, I didn't go back to my apartment. The police advised against it. I packed a bag under supervision and stayed with a friend. As I lay in a strange bed, staring at the ceiling, one final message came through, sent earlier, delayed by the system. It was never delivered to my phone. The officer showed it to me later. One sentence: "You were supposed to notice me sooner." And in that moment, I understood the truth completely. This wasn't about the phone. It was about access, opportunity, and how easily modern life hands both to the wrong person. The arrest didn't happen the way movies make you expect. There were no flashing lights outside my window, no dramatic knock on the door, just a phone call. Officer Ramirez called me 2 days later while I was sitting on the edge of a borrowed bed, staring at a suitcase I still hadn't unpacked. "We have him," he said. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "You're sure?" I finally asked. "Yes," he replied, "and we need you to come in." My hands started shaking again, but this time it was different. This wasn't fear. This was the weight of knowing the invisible thing that had been watching me finally had a face. At the station, they sat me in a quiet interview room. Claire was there too, the cybercrime analyst. She gave me a small nod that felt grounding. Officer Ramirez placed a file on the table. Inside were screenshots, cafe surveillance footage, a still image of the man sitting across from me sliding my phone back across the table. Ethan. That was his real name, but it wasn't his first. "He's done this before," Officer Ramirez said carefully. "Different cities, same method." My stomach twisted. "How many?" I asked. "Enough," he said, "but you're the first case where we caught him early." They explained everything. When Ethan found my phone, he didn't panic or rush. He didn't try to steal it permanently. He took his time. He accessed it just long enough to install a monitoring profile, a hidden configuration that mirrored selected data back to a private server. It didn't trigger antivirus software. It didn't look suspicious. It didn't slow the phone enough to raise alarms. Then he waited. He learned my routines, my habits, my emotional patterns. When he returned the phone at the cafe, it was intentional. Public place, witnesses, no pressure. Trust built instantly. The calls came later, the messages, each one designed not to threaten, but to prove. Prove that he knew me. Prove that privacy was already gone. "He wanted you unsettled," Claire said, "but not running. That's important." "Why?" I asked. "Because fear makes people predictable," she replied. They showed me more. Screenshots taken from my own phone. Not explicit, not graphic, just intimate. The corner of my bedroom, the suitcase under the bed, a reflection in a mirror I didn't even remember being in the background. Moments I never consented to sharing. That's when something inside me finally broke, not into panic, but into anger. "He said I should have noticed him sooner," I said quietly. Officer Ramirez nodded. "That's a common trait," he said. "This wasn't about technology, it was about attention." They arrested Ethan the same morning. At his apartment, they found hard drives, encrypted storage, folders labeled with first names. Mine was there. Seeing my name typed out in someone else's system, someone I'd never invited into my life, made my skin crawl. But it also meant something else. It meant it was over. After the statement, after the paperwork, after the shock finally settled, the police gave me one final recommendation. Don't go back to that phone, even wiped, even reset. Replace it. I did. New phone, new number, new passwords, new habits. I moved apartments 2 months later, not because I had to, because I wanted my sense of safety back. The last thing Claire said to me before we parted stays with me to this day. "Technology didn't make this possible," she said. "Access did." It took a long time before I stopped jumping at notifications, before I stopped covering my camera, before silence stopped feeling threatening. But here's the truth, the part I'm telling you this story for. I did everything right. I met a stranger in public. I trusted kindness. I assumed the danger would look dangerous, and that's why it worked. So if there's one thing you take from this, one thing you remember, it's this. If your phone ever leaves your control, even briefly, treat it like your keys were copied. Because your phone doesn't just know where you live, it knows how you live. And sometimes the scariest monsters don't break in. They wait for you to invite them, without even realizing you did.